Hello, everyone. We've got about 1 minute before the official start, but I just wanted to double check for those of you that showed up a little bit early if you can hear and see me. So can someone give me a heads up in the chat if you can hear me? Awesome, excellent. And you're seeing the screen as well? Awesome. Yeah, we are using a new tool, Crowdcast, for this presentation. So hopefully, thank you, Bruno. So hopefully you will all enjoy this a little bit better than the previous Zoom chats. So this is going to be a reprisal with some minor modifications from the talk I gave on governance at the Web3 Summit. If you did show up to that, then this will be a nice reprise. You can see we made some minor modifications since then. Otherwise, if you missed the Web3 Summit, you'll have a chance to check it out. So as Hutch mentioned, there is a Ask a Question button that you can, if you do have a question, please ask by clicking the Ask a Question. That will do two things. Not only will it alert me that you have a question, but it also, when we do the recording, it will allow you to have a link directly to that time. So then you can see the list of questions and actually point directly to that. So thank you, Anson, for asking a question. So I'm going to start answering that. And this is the answer to the test question. So now when when you go to see the video, you'll also have a link to all the questions in text, and you can link directly to when I answer them. So if you have a question that's more general, I'll ask that you hold off until the Q&A. But if you don't understand something that I'm saying, or you think that I need to have some clarification, please feel free to raise your hand and ask a question. All right, so let's start here with the All right. So this is a talk on Polkadot blockchain governance. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Bill Laboon. I'm a technical educator here at the Web3 Foundation. If you have any questions after this, or that you think of after the talk, feel free to get in touch with me, Bill at web3.foundation, or on Twitter at Bill Laboon. Sorry, I hit the wrong button here. All right, so first, I want to spend just a moment discussing what do we mean by governance? When we say on-chain governance or blockchain governance or governance of Polkadot, what do we mean by this word governance? So sort of the generic definition is the rules by which a society operates. That is governance. So you're probably used to governance in the sense of a government. However, I think a very important aspect of governance is also how do we change these rules? No society ever has kept the exact same rules that they've started with and kept them unchanged for hundreds of years. As new technologies appear, as people discover what works and what doesn't, we often want to change the rules. And this is just as true in blockchain and blockchain technologies or other technologies as it is for a society. Now, in many cases, the governance changes or how things operate is done in an ad hoc or informal manner. But we at the people behind Polkadot have really tried to think about how to make a good governance mechanism and one that can be made better and improved to go along with what the society, that is the people using Polkadot, actually are interested in. So not to get too deep into the political science here, although I do have a link if you're interested in more information, it turns out there is no perfect governance mechanism. So if you want to have a governance mechanism that will always reflect what the will of the people is for some definition, or for a will of the members, it turns out that no matter what kind of mechanism you produce, there are always going to be trade-offs. And this has actually been mathematically proven. Really, the only way to not have any trade-offs in a way to govern a system is if you have a dictator. And you say the only person whose opinion matters is the dictator. And we certainly don't want that. But we have determined that there are better and worse ways of governing if we have certain goals that we want to achieve. But I do want you to keep in mind that any kind of system that we have, there are going to be trade-offs. Okay? You see this in the real world. There are different countries, different nation states have different ways of governing, and there are pluses and minuses to each of them. Okay. So what are we using governance for, both in Polkadot and specifically for Kusama? So since Kusama is actually produced and ready, Polkadot's Canary network, it is out there and in use. I'm going to be talking a lot about how Kusama is governing and what governance is being used for in Kusama. But I will make note a few times, and especially the last section of this talk, about specific things that are planned for Polkadot but are not yet implemented in Kusama. So, but what is governance used for in general? Well, one thing is we are going to want to modify parameters of the system. So for example, what the voting period is, how long of a cool-off or enactment period is necessary. All of these specific parameters of the runtime may be something that we want to modify going forward. Should we update the runtime code? This would be the equivalent of a hard fork for other systems. And if so, what code should we add? So we actually can vote to update and modify the code that we're actually running on. I always thought this was very interesting because we're using some code to vote on whether or not we should update that code. It's very, very recursive. What kind of interactions will we allow with parachains? Which parachains do we want to have online? Do we want to sanction them? So if you recall from how Polkadot works, we have a central relay chain, but parachains, either pure parachains or parathreads, which are semi-independent parallel blockchains, can interact with the relay chain and interact with each other. And so we may want to have a vote on how much and what kinds of interactions do we allow. So this list is not inclusive. There are a lot of things that we'll use governance for, but it's basically so that members of the system, stakeholders in the sense of people who own dots, are allowed to make decisions about how the system is upgraded and updated, and done in a consistent, formalized manner, and not just ad hoc. So we see in other systems that that are out there that there isn't really a system of on-chain governance. So that doesn't mean that those systems don't have governance just because it's off-chain. Bitcoin, for instance, they certainly have different ways that people can, for example, that miners can indicate their acceptance of a proposal, or that people can always fork off, as we've seen with for example, Bitcoin Cash, or some some of the other forks of Bitcoin. However, with Polkadot, we really wanted to make sure there was an explicit way that people could, that stakeholders in the system could decide what is going to be the future of the network. What are the kinds of things that we want to change? Okay? We really wanted this all to be made explicit and not implicit. So there are benefits and drawbacks to either way of doing it. So we have thought that the benefits of doing things on chain certainly outweigh the drawbacks. So some of the benefits are, we have a clear way of doing things. We have a way of determining things very explicitly. But on the other hand, if there is some sort of problem, it's just like a smart contract, right? If there's a problem with the algorithm that we're using, it may be difficult for us to do it in an off-chain way, right? And come to a consensus in a different using a different mechanism. So the basic concept that you were using with on-chain governance is stakeholder voting. So a democratic system, but similar to shareholder voting. So just like if you have somebody who owns 1 million shares in a company, they're going to get a in a shareholder vote, they're going to receive more weight than somebody who bought 1 share of a company. If you own Kusama tokens or dots, you can vote. And the more Kusama tokens or dots that you have, the more voting power that you have. So there is a possibility for pure blockchain democracy. So you could say every address gets a vote, but this is vulnerable to a variety of attacks, especially Sybil attacks, where somebody could just trivially pretend to be 100 people or 1,000 people or 10,000 people. So that's why one of the reasons that we have stakeholder voting is, as opposed to a pure democracy, is to avoid these attacks. But also, this means that those who have the most stake in the network, those who own a share of it or own a share of the governance, can, in fact, because their motives are most aligned with the system and ensuring that the system continues, we're giving extra weight to their vote. Is another way of thinking about it. But so a core tenet of governance in Kusama is that any change to the protocol, any change that we want to make, needs to be agreed upon by stake weight. That is, the majority of stake can always command the network. So if more than 50% of the system votes on something, on the future of the system, of the protocol, then that change will be made. Okay? So there are some wrinkles to this. However, this is a core tenet, is that if we have more than 50% of stake that are in favor of something, that should be made. That change should be made. There shouldn't be a way for 5% of the stake to override this. So the governance structure that Kusama has been called tricameral. So there are really 3 branches. They're not actual branches like in an official government, but they act as very, very similarly. I think it's a good analogy to make. The referendum chamber, that is everybody who owns Kusama or on Polkadot dots. That is the group that has to vote on any change made to the network. There is also the Polkadot or Kusama Council, which is a group which is going to represent the passive holders. And we'll see that the Polkadot Council is voted in via the referendum chamber. That is, those people who hold Kusama or DOT tokens can vote in people to the council. And the council has very, very specific powers. And these powers can always be overridden by the referendum chamber. Finally, there's the technical committee. And the technical committee is a group represents the technical aspects of the team. So if you develop a Polkadot runtime environment or a Polkadot runtime, you will get 1 vote on this committee. And the technical committee is meant for really those situations where there is an urgent technical issue with the network. And they have very prescribed powers, which basically is that with the agreement of the council, they can produce fast-tracked referenda in case there is a technical issue that needs to be solved. And we'll discuss exactly what that means by fast-tracking. But the basic idea is when there is a technical issue, the council and technical committee can make sure that a vote very quickly comes to pass. Once again, the referendum chamber, that is people who own Kusama or DOTs, can override this, although we anticipate that in a situation where both the council and the technical committee agree on a technical issue, that probably will be very rare that the community would override it. So there are a couple of mechanisms that we're going to discuss that add additional wrinkles into this basic idea. Or first, I want to discuss exactly what is a referendum. What is this concept of people voting on? What are they voting on? The idea of fast tracking, which I've already mentioned very briefly here. The concept of adaptive quorum biasing, which can see how we can avoid sort of tyranny of the minority and also allow passive holders to have a voice. And finally, time-locked voting, which is how, depending on if you are willing to hold your dots for longer, you can actually have more voting power. So if you are an owner of Kusamas or dots, what do you have the power to do? So you can do quite a few things. First, you can propose a referendum. And we'll discuss exactly what this means, but basically you can propose that you have an idea of how the network wants to change, and you can propose that this is what you want, how you want the network to work going forward. You can prioritize public referenda. That is, if somebody else has issued a referendum that you think should be voted on sooner rather than later, you can actually put your dots behind it to ensure that it goes to the front of the list. You can vote on referenda. So if there is a referendum, you can vote for it or against it. You can vote for council members. So these are the people that are representing you on the Polkadot Council. And finally, you can become a council member. So you actually could join the Polkadot Council and be one of these accounts that represent the more passive holders. So I've already mentioned referenda, but I've just kept it very informal, as voting on something. You can think of it as a bill that wants to be passed. It is the core aspect of governance. It's how we make changes. And all of the different branches, all they really have the power to do is propose referenda. So a referendum contains some proposal to do something, and this is a very formalized proposal. It's actually either a function call or actual code modification. So a person can actually look and see what code changes are going to be made, as opposed to something that is in perhaps ambiguous language, right? Like English, writing in English or Chinese or French or whatever. There's often an ambiguity. That's one of the reasons that courts do such good business. However, the proposal is going to contain code or a function call that's going to do something very explicit and that we can verify and look at beforehand. So this referendum, which contains a proposal, is always going to be binary. So you have two votes you can make, aye, yes, or nay, no. Theoretically, you could consider abstaining also a kind of vote. So you don't have to vote. You could just buy dots or kusamas and just never actually look at a vote going forward. But there's never any vote where you can't vote aye or nay. Everything it's binary, right? It makes sense. Since it is computing related, that it is binary. It can either be yes or no. There is no, someone is voting to take 50 kusamas from the treasury. I want to vote at only 25. You can only vote aye or nay. You could have multiple proposals, but for each individual referendum that proposal contains, or contains that proposal rather, you can only vote yes or no. So what are some things that you can do with these proposals? You can modify the balance of an account. You could add or delist a parachain. You might want to modify blockchain parameters. So for example, if you've determined that the penalties for being a bad validator are too strong or perhaps too weak, you think that if a validator goes offline, they should get more of their values slashed. You can do that. If you think that blocks are too slow, it should be generated more quickly. That's another parameter that you could issue a proposal to try to modify. You might want to fund a project from the treasury. So the Polkadot Council Polkadot, as part of fees, actually has a treasury that can be used, that's funded by fees that can be used to send to projects. You might want to fund one of these projects. So you would transfer some of those the kusamas or dots that are in the treasury to this project, to this address. You could cancel some other referendum or referenda. You can even modify the Polkadot runtime code itself. So this is the most powerful command. You can actually change what code is running for the Polkadot runtime. This would be the equivalent in another chain of doing a hard fork. So this is something that can actually be done online, although this is obviously very dangerous. You would probably want to make sure that you really understand the system before issuing a proposal like this. So once you've decided on a proposal, eventually it has to become a referendum. So there's something called a launch period, and which is it's 28 days, or very close to that because it's based on block time. One launch period in Kusama is 28 days. The proposal with the most stake behind it is selected to become a referendum. So it's actually slightly more complicated than this, in that there are two queues, one from the Polkadot Council and one from the public. And they alternate between launch periods. So the one launch period, a proposal from Polkadot Council will become a referendum, and in the second launch period, a proposal from the public will become a referendum. That assumes that if the queue is empty, then it'll just continue with that same. If the other queue is empty, it'll continue with the same queue. You can increase stake behind a proposal by seconding. That is, adding some more of your dots. You need to stake some dots to issue a proposal. And if you would like that proposal to go to get up, you can actually stake your own dots behind it. Once that proposal becomes a referendum, anyone with stake can vote upon it during that launch period. Okay. Only one referendum will be available at a time. Except again for emergency referenda, the ones that are fast-tracked. I talked, that is when there is a major issue and the technical committee and council both agree that we need an emergency referendum. And the reason for having this is this prevents conflicting referenda from being voted on at the same time. So you can imagine if there are two referenda, one is to add parachain X, and the other one is to prohibit parachain X from connecting to the relay chain. Well, which one, if they both pass, which is possible, what would happen? That's weird, undefined behavior. So by making this sort of synchronous, by having only one referendum voted upon at a time, this helps prevent conflicting referenda. If a referendum is passed, it's enacted after 30 days. So this is what's called delayed enactment. So this gives a chance, if people really disagree with what the referendum did, what the proposal was contained, they'll have a chance to say, well, I'm leaving the network. I really don't want to be a part of this anymore. This also gives a chance, for everyone to prepare for whatever change is being made. So, for example, if the runtime changes, people who expected that block times were of a specific time or that a particular algorithm was used, they'll have a chance to get their own code and projects and related things ready for that. All right. I'm not sure if I see actually some questions here. So I'm going to answer them now. I apologize. I couldn't see them actually with the screen. I'll have to look into that for next time. So why unusual naming for? So why so unusual naming for yes, no instead of just yes, no? So the answer is I and nay are sort of a classical name for yes and no in English. You will actually see in most voting systems that if you watch the U.S. Congress or Parliament in the UK, they actually use aye and nay for yes and no in regards to a vote. So I'm not sure of the exact etymology why that is different, but it certainly is a traditional way of answering a vote is aye, nay instead of yes, no. So what is the difference between referenda and referendum? So referenda is just the plural of referendum. So it's a weird plural. And as someone else has already commented, the more common form of this is referendums. However, in the code base, they use referenda as the plural. And so just to maintain parity with the code base, we're also using the term referenda for the plural. All right, so while I'm here, any other questions? So I apologize, as I mentioned, I can't see questions being asked while the screen is up. So I will just stop after the next section to make sure that if there are any questions that I'll be able to answer them in a timely manner. Okay, so, right. So I've already mentioned that with Polkadot, we know that there is no perfect governance system. However, we have seen issues that other blockchains have come across when they've had on-chain governance. And one of the problems is that there are generally only a very small percentage of people voting. So even in in national elections, there's generally not 100% or even close to 100% voting in most locations, and we see a very small percentage of people voting on blockchains that enable it. Often in the single digits. So this is kind of problematic because let's say that somebody has a vote, or excuse me, a proposal that they want to give their account 1 million dots or 1 million Kusama tokens. And they know that in August, most people are away and they've got a pretty significant chunk of stake. So let's say they've got 0.6% of stake, but very few people are actually paying attention. So they might vote aye and have a 60% vote, but only 1/100th of the stake is only some very small percentage of the stake votes, like 1% or less. Well, does this really mean that this new Polkadot holder that should get whatever 1 million dots simply because most people weren't paying attention? So we have implemented an algorithm called adaptive quorum biasing that basically means, depending upon who proposes the referendum, where the proposal comes from, it can take a larger number or a larger percentage of stake to pass it, depending on how much of the stake votes. So that's a little bit complicated to say, but I think that when we see a graph in another slide or two, it'll make more sense. But basically, the percentage of stake that you need to pass a referendum varies based on the number of people who vote for it. So if a very small number of people vote for a referendum, a very high percentage is needed to pass it. But as we mentioned, a majority of stake can always command the network. So if 50% plus 1 of the stake votes for something, it should always pass. Okay, so if we get everybody voting for it, and if we have more than 50% of the entire stake, it should always pass. So if we look at this, the orange line, and I'll talk about what the green and red dotted lines mean shortly, we can see that is the percentage that is needed based on what the turnout percentage is. So we can see at 100%, it acts like a simple majority carries. if 50% plus one vote for something, then it will pass. Otherwise, it will fail. But generally, we're going to want to be a bit conservative and require more of a majority if a very small number of, if a smaller amount rather of stake is voting. So the actual algorithm, you can look at the democracy module if you would like to see exactly how this is implemented in Rust. But it basically is the square root of the voting stake compared to the square root of the total electorate. But what this means is we have this curve where if, for example, 10% of people are voting, you're going to need 10% of stake rather. You're going to need a supermajority of about 76% in order to pass something. Again, we want to be conservative. We want to err on the side of not passing for a generic proposal. Okay? We are going to assume that those passive holders, they generally would just like to keep things the same. We don't want to have every single proposal passing. We want to err on the side of staying where we are. Again, if a true majority of stake does vote for something more than 50%, however, then you will pass. 50% of the total stake, you should be able votes in favor of something, you'll be able to pass, no matter what percentage we have here of this orange line. So I'm just gonna check one question here. So someone asked, how does a Sybil attack during voting work? So correct. So when a person creates many accounts, they can vote as a majority, and that's why we use stake-weighted voting. So in order for someone to vote, your vote is based on the number of dots you own. So there is an economic deterrent to Sybil attacks. You would have to buy a majority of the stake. So it is possible, of course, that someone would buy 50% plus one of all dots in existence. And so, but hopefully a person who did that from a game theoretical perspective would also have a real vested interest in ensuring the stability of the network, because they have just sunk an incredibly large amount of money or something into getting that amount of the stake. So I've already mentioned briefly the Polkadot Council. So this is 6 to 24 elected members. The number can vary and is actually modifiable via the referendum mechanism, who are going to represent the passive members of the community. These are elected by approval voting. So that is, you can either approve or disapprove of accounts who are running to be on the council. And while they will get voted on about once every 2 weeks. It's a rotating system. So every 2 weeks, one person or one account rather can be removed, and then another person added on. So every 2 weeks on Kusama, there will be a vote that all dot holders are allowed to participate in, and they can mark of the people running for this Polkadot office how many which ones they approve of and or don't approve of. And then whoever has the most approval can be elected into the council. So the council is not, has very specific and limited powers. So first, they can approve who goes on the technical committee. So they will approve that somebody has, in fact, written either a Polkadot runtime or a runtime environment. They can veto referenda, although this can then be overridden by the Kusama or Polkadot holders. Along with the technical committee, they can fast-track referenda. And perhaps most importantly, they can propose their own referenda. So remember I said that every launch period, it flips back and forth between a publicly produced proposal becoming a referendum, and a council produced proposal becoming a referendum. So the council controls half of the legislative agenda. Again, not all of the legislative agenda, because any individual dot holder or Kusama holder can propose a proposal for to become a referendum. But they do, these small number of accounts actually can control half of the legislative agenda. So they have very specific powers here, and all of their powers really can be eventually, directly or indirectly, voted upon by, and thus overridden by the Kusama or Polkadot stakeholders. So we already mentioned in terms of voting. So here's one of the reasons that the council does have, one of the ways that the council does have power is that a public referendum had a positive turnout bias. That is, via adaptive quorum biasing, the vote is biased towards not passing. However, if the council issues a referendum, there's actually two different kinds of referenda that can be produced and they will not have a positive turnout bias. So if every account on the council votes for this referendum, it's what's called a negative quorum bias. So this is like the opposite of positive turnout bias. It's biased towards passing. We can assume that if everybody that was voted onto the council unanimously agrees that something needs to be passed, that in general it should be passed unless the general holders are very much against it. Once again, with 50% plus one of the full stake of the network, this can always be overridden. But generally, we assume that a referendum has extra power and is easier to pass if it has been unanimously backed by the council. If a majority, but not every member of the council, votes for a referendum, it's a traditional 50% plus one wins, no matter no matter what percentage of the stake votes for it. So if we have a council decision that is even a little bit controversial, that at least one person voted against it, but it is backed by more than 50% of the council, then it becomes a traditional 50% plus one wins system. Now, if a proposal occurs that is not backed by a majority of the council, it never becomes a referendum. It never goes up for a vote. So if we look back at our adaptive quorum biasing chart here, so we can see that the green line represents an unanimous council referendum, unanimously passed council referendum, where once again, at 100% of voters, it acts just like a normal 50% plus one passes, but with less turnout, with fewer accounts, or excuse me, stake voting for it. As long as it gets past the green line, it passes. So as long as we get at least 20, for example, at 10%, as long as we get more than about 25% voting for it, then it will pass. So this is sort of the power of the council, is that it biases the vote in a different way. But again, the vote can still be overridden. If the red dotted line is the majority carries, no matter what percentage of people turn out, of accounts and stake turn out, as long as the majority vote for it, it passes. If not, it fails. All right, so there is another wrinkle to this. As I mentioned, there are a few wrinkles to this basic design. So TimeLock Voting, you can lock up your stake in order to what I think of as pump up your vote. So you can say that you are willing, if this passes, to keep your tokens and not transfer them if the referendum passes, it aligns with your vote. So if you want to put, you really think that this particular referendum should pass rather, then you can say, well, if as long as it passes, I'm willing to keep my stake locked up for a long period of time. And you can do, just so you know, you can do other things with your stake at this. If you want to bond, for instance, or nominate, a validator, you still can use it. You just can't transfer your stake if you lock it. This is only if the referendum aligns with your vote. So if it goes against you, then you have the opportunity to say, well, I really thought this was necessary for the system to continue, for this referendum to be passed, but since it isn't, I'm taking my dots and leaving. I'm selling them or transferring them or getting off the network. So this basically acts like an exponential scale, or a logarithmic scale, I guess, depending on which way you look at it. By default, to get 1x your vote, you would lock for 4 weeks. You're basically the length of the launch period. However, if you can pre-commit to holding for a longer period of time, every time you double it, you get 1x more vote. Or you can say, I want to vote, but I don't want to lock up my tokens, in which case your voting power is drastically reduced. So we can assume, in terms of ensuring that the majority of stake can command the network, that this majority of stake is also committed to holding those tokens on for a long period of time. So as long as they are locked, you don't need to make this decision on every vote. You could just say, I'm going to set this, that I'm going to hold them for the next 128 weeks, and then for every vote until that ends, you will get that time lock multiplier. So the final branch that I want to discuss is the technical committee. This, especially at the beginning, is going to have a very small number of teams added to it. So teams are added or potentially removed from the technical committee by the council. They decide who gets on it. So you can get 1 vote if you've developed a working and verified Polkadot runtime environment. So we have some teams working on that now. And 1 vote if you have developed the current runtime for the network. So if you remember how the system works, there is the runtime environment, and then which is the surrounding shell, if you will, and software of a node running, and a 1 vote for the actual runtime, which is the WASM blob that actually explains how that controls the state transition function of the network and related code. It is possible for a team to have multiple votes, so if they've done multiple runtime environments, or perhaps if they've written an environment plus they are the ones who develop the current runtime. The technical committee has 1 real power. We assume that these are going to be the teams that are very involved and understand well the technical aspects of the system because they have helped to develop it. They can fast track proposals to allow them to be immediately brought to a referendum with a very short voting time. So 3 days compared to 28 days for a normal referendum, and near 0 enactment time. So a few blocks. So again, this is meant for, hey, there's a problem with the system. We have some sort of consensus issue or something that needs to be fixed very, very quickly. And the technical committee, along with the council, can create one of these proposals. They're the only ones that can create a fast-track proposal. This requires at least 3/4 agreement of the Polkadot Council and 2/3 agreement of the technical committee. Again, we anticipate in situations like this, they will be rare and probably unanimous when there is a major issue with the system and we require an upgrade quickly. All right, so that's the basics of Kusama governance. at least at Genesis. I want to talk briefly after this about how the governance is going to change post-Genesis, and some things that we want to have either later in Kusama or only upon Polkadot launch. But first, I'll answer some of these questions that I see here. So when the tokens are locked, where are they locked to? So they are locked to your address. So if you have an address that has an account with N tokens, they are going to be locked to that address for a period of time. Again, that doesn't mean you can't do anything with them at that address. You just simply can't transfer them. So you could bond or vote your stake for other things, but they are locked to the specific address that they are at. And who adjusts all these parameters? And you're right, like you're seeing 3/4 or 2/3 or 60%. It does seem, I can imagine it seeming a little bit arbitrary. So I'm going to answer first on who originally created them, and that was our research team. If you go to research.polkadot.network, you can see some of the rationale behind them. But these parameters are adjustable via referendum. So if you want to modify them, you can make a proposal to change the specific parameters going forward. However, it would be a referendum. Your proposal would have to be voted on and produced. So can you vote for other referenda if tokens are locked? And yes, so when we say locked, what we mean is they can't be transferred to a different address. But you can do things like bond or vote for, so let's say you lock for 8 weeks and the next referendum comes up, you can still use that stake to vote. You simply cannot transfer the tokens to another address. All right, so let's go to the last section that I want to discuss today, which is some of the post-Genesis governance, which is planned, and either for later on in Kusama or perhaps at Polkadot mainnet. So both of these concepts that I want to discuss, I just want to warn you that they're not very well defined yet. So they are subject to change. I just wanted to give you an idea of some of the things that we are thinking about doing as the system continues. So you may have heard of the Oracle problem. So it's very easy to verify that something occurs when it's on the blockchain, right? It's very easy for me to verify that a transaction occurred or that there are so many blocks that something happened at a specific block. However, the Oracle problem is there's no real way to verify, as well as you can verify for entirely on blockchain data, the determination of truth in some real world state. So for example, with Augur, the voting platform where people are able to bet on things happening in the real world, such as who won an election or what the temperature is like in Des Moines on October 17th. There's no real way to make an objective determination just deterministically, on chain. And so there are a variety of ways that others have figured out ways to do this. So for example, by providing reputation points or Oracle marketplaces. So our idea is to have an Oracle committee. So well-qualified professionals who that are going to be geographically and geopolitically diverse, who, in the case of conflict, can act as judges, basically, to determine one way or another who was correct or what was the correct situation. So again, there are some ideas on exactly how to do this. What percentage would we want from different areas? But the idea is that we wouldn't want this focused anywhere geographically or politically, but rather a large group of people, at least several hundred from around the world, who'd be part of this Oracle committee and could make decisions again, in the case of conflict. So if we have one oracle that is stating that the temperature in Pittsburgh on October 17th was 5 Celsius, and another group that said it was 40 Celsius, well, one is correct and one is incorrect, right? And so the goal, and knowing Pittsburgh, it is almost always probably going to be 5 Celsius, much more often than 40 Celsius. So the goal of the Oracle Committee is to have an official group who, in the case of conflict like this, can make a determination over which is correct. The other interesting idea that we want to add is what are called SSCs, or Spontaneous Subject Committees. So this is going to be a subset of all holders of Kusama. You register to be part of a group. So this group might be people like validators, for instance, or people interested in oracles, or people interested in networking. So you could sign up to be a part of a group, and then if you were signed up to be part of this ephemeral group, you'd be randomly chosen. It's sort of like the old Greek mechanism of democracy, where you randomly choose a group or a subset of people to make a decision, and they will actually get paid to vote on a particular proposal. You can even delegate if you get asked a question and say, you know what, this particular idea is not, or this particular thing is not in my wheelhouse. It's not my area of expertise. You can be passive and delegate to someone else. And then if more than 95% of the subset approves, the measure passes. If less than 40% approve, it fails. If it's some group in between, we'll increase the size of the subset and try again. So the idea is, if some very large majority, super majority, more than 95% of a group associated with this approve of a measure, then it should pass automatically. On the other hand, if they don't, then the measure fails. Otherwise, we can increase the size of the subset and try again. So again, a larger number, a larger selection. If we continue to get between 40 and 95% of the subset approving, that is, there is no decision, it would just revert to a standard referendum. So this is an interesting idea of random choosing of a subset. Again, it is not implemented. It's something that we're considering trying out as we go forward, especially for those referenda that may be very specialized and technical, and not everyone would understand the particular topic that's being discussed. All right, so that is everything that I have. So once again, I'll just put this on the screen. So I see we have a few questions that I will spend some time answering now with the time we have remaining. But if you do have any questions, my email is bill@web3foundation, or on Twitter at @BillLaboon, or you can see me as Bill W3F in the various Riot channels. So yeah, so to answer these questions, thank you for people that are upvoting too, by the way. So if I can see there aren't that many questions now, but if there are a lot of questions, you can always add your upvote to see who is, which questions are most pressing. All right, can you further lock your funds on a following referenda if you are already locked? So I'm not 100% sure I know what you mean by that, but what I think you mean, and feel free to ask as a follow-up if I don't actually answer what you're asking. So if you want to increase the amount of time that you are locking your funds for to continue getting that time lock, yes, you can increase the funds. But so for example, if you lock it for 64 weeks, and so you're getting the 5x multiplier, you're getting the 5x multiplier for all of those votes, votes on those referenda until that ends. But you can, midway through, you can increase that. If you vote for one referendum with yeah, so if you vote for one referendum with 100 dots for and lock for 6 weeks, can use those same funds for a referendum in 2 weeks. Yes, so you can always vote with their lock. You can always use your vote for that. And if your lock is continuing, you're still going to get that time lock multiplier. So basically, to answer your question, yes. Does your secondary lock reset the lock timeline, or does it compound? So the idea is during that lock, that any referendum voted while you're being locked, you get that multiplier. So if you add more on, it would just add that to the end. So it would, if you can continue to lock. It doesn't lock just for that referendum. So will these features be ready on the mainnet? So the things, the Polkadot Council, the idea of adaptive quorum biasing, basically everything that I discussed that was not part of those when I mentioned, like, the spontaneous subject committees and the Oracle committees, which are just planned. We don't know. Everything else is going to be ready for the mainnet. For Oracle committees or spontaneous subject committees, the timeline for those is a little bit up in the air. So we're not, I don't want to make any promises if they'll be ready on the mainnet or not. But everything else should be. How long is the voting referendum period? So with Kusama, it's 28 days. This is adjustable via governance, so you could actually change. You could actually make a referendum to change the referendum voting period. And I don't think it's been defined yet for Polkadot mainnet. I would assume it would be very similar. I haven't heard anything about it changing. But one of the nice things about Kusama is we can see if it turns out like that's a good amount of time or bad. So we may modify it for mainnet depending on what we see acting in Kusama. Sort of a related question here from John Foe. If my lock ends in the middle of the referendum period, does it not null my multiplier? No, it's at the time that you actually make your vote. How is Sybil attack prevented on the referendum? So Sybil attack is prevented via by your stake. So the fact is, doesn't matter how many accounts vote for something, you need to have a specific amount of stake to make something pass. We could have 100, so 100 accounts with 1 dot each doesn't matches one account with 100. So with 100 dots behind it in stake. So the Sybil, so just because you create accounts doesn't mean that you get additional additional voting. You would have to obtain stake somehow in the network, that is dots or Kusama tokens. So it's basically an economic way of preventing Sybil attacks, as opposed to something like Bitcoin, which uses a sort of a computational way of preventing Sybil attacks and block reduction. All right. Are there? Oh. So can you stake in a nominator with 100 dots and then also stake those 100 dots in voting, or are they reserved? No. If you have the if you have those dots bonded, you can still use them for voting. You still own that stake, even though you were using that. You were using them sort of for 2 different things. You can still use them to vote. That's if you. And how does this work in case of a slash? That is an interesting edge case that I don't think I have an answer to off the top of my head. I'd have to get back to you. You're right. I just don't know off the top of my head. But if you ping me on Riot or somewhere else, I'd be happy to look into this and figure out what exactly happens in the case of a slash. I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly. I can imagine different possibilities. I just don't know off the top of my head which specific things would happen. If you loan out your dots for an IPO, can you still vote? I'm not sure what this means exactly. So if you've what we're looking at in terms of locking is that the dots don't leave your account. So if you loan them to somebody else in the sense that you are sending them to another account, you would not be able to vote with that stake. If they are somehow on your account still, so I'm not sure what you mean by an IPO here, but as long as they're in your account, you can lock with them. If you send them to another account, you cannot. So I see. Initial parachain offering. Well, if you send them, so basically, as long as it's depending on the way they do that. As long as the if it's going to a different account, you will not be able to lock with them. All right. Any other questions? All right, I think that is 2 o'clock. So once again, if you have any questions or any words to say about our new platform, I think this is really cool. I really enjoy it. I like this ask a question. It's much easier from my perspective. I'm happy to hear about it. And yeah, thank you all for coming. And I'm sure I will see many of you around. Bye.